Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at First Baptist Church. I'm happy that you can be here with us today, which I'm sure is a cold day at your house. We've had plenty of winter weather this week. We're starting our study in the book of Daniel today. Daniel is the last of the major prophets. He comes after Ezekiel. He's in exile at the same time that Ezekiel is. Apparently they may not even have communicated with one another. And he's one of the most familiar stories in the Old Testament. In fact, the three stories that we have in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, familiar to most all of us. Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel's 3 friends who are thrown into the fiery furnace, and what we see today with Daniel and his 3 friends deciding that they would not defile themselves eating the king's table. So let's look at this book of Daniel. It is an excellent book because of the personal side of it when we see the stories here. You can divide Daniel into 2 sections quite easily. The first 6 chapters record the events of the life of Daniel. As I said, they're stories about Daniel. The last 6 chapters are the visions that Daniel sees in which God spoke to him directly about things to come. There's also one other interesting division that we won't explore too much because it's way above my pay grade. Chapters 1 to 2:4 and chapters 8:1 to 12:13 are written in Hebrew. The rest of it, 2:4 to 7:28, are written in Aramaic. In fact, they address different topics. The Aramaic portion deals with the nations of the world and their progress, while the Hebrew section deals with the people of God and their particular situation in the midst of the nations. Whatever the reason for this arrangement, there's still a lot for us to learn from the book of Daniel. There is apocalyptic literature in Daniel. We'll get to that toward the end. Apocalyptic literature is always difficult for us to interpret, and it leads itself to lots of speculation about different things. This first part, though, is a solid storybook telling us about Daniel and his life. So, if you will, let's look at chapter 1, and we'll see verses 1 and 2. We're going to go all the way through the chapter here today. In verse 1, Daniel says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God." Now let's look just at a little historical background here so we can get the lay of the land of where we are. The 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, most biblical commentators and historians agree that the date for that is 605 BC. It really is in the ancient world a very important date because 605 BC is the Battle of Carchemish, which was a showdown between Babylon and Assyria and Egypt. Babylon, of course, winning the day. And then it's only 4 years after Judah lost what was probably its best hope. Because in 609 BC, when Egypt was maneuvering through Palestine to go and assist Syria, King Josiah, good King Josiah, went out to meet the army of the Pharaoh Necho, and he was killed at Megiddo. And that was a catastrophe for Judah because Josiah was a great hope for them. The kings that followed him, especially Jehoiakim and others, Zedekiah, they were a very poor bunch, and they did not do much to help. Jehoiakim was put on the throne by Egypt and pretty much was under their thumb for most of the time. And after this battle of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar swung down to the south just a bit, and he picked off Jerusalem, and he took away some of the royal family and some of the nobility with him and left Jerusalem as a vassal to him. And he took those people with him to Babylon. And it wouldn't be but about 8 years later that he would come and destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple at Jerusalem. And that would be when Ezekiel, when we were studying Ezekiel, went into Babylonian captivity. So Daniel would have been already in Babylon for about 8 years when Ezekiel showed up. As we look at this book, we need to understand that this is the only place in the Bible where we find out information about Daniel. The scripture describes him as part of the royal household, which was not an uncommon thing for kings of antiquity to do. They would take members of the royal household with them as hostages to keep from rebellions being started back in the place that they had conquered. And in lots of cases, they'd hold them for ransom. But in this case, he was one of the hostages that's being held. And so Daniel went to Babylon, and he would remain there for the rest of his life, as far as we can tell. We cannot see anywhere in the biblical record that he ever returned to Palestine. In the book of Daniel, it tells us that he stayed there until 536 BC, the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, who would come in and defeat the Babylonian forces and place them under his dominance. I like what Alexander McLaren says about the life of Daniel. Here's what McLaren says. Daniel's career covered the whole period of the captivity and burned like a star of hope for the exiles. The incident in our passage today is a noble example of religious principle applied to small details of daily life and shows how God crowns such conscientious self-restraint with success. That describes Daniel. Conscientious self-restraint. We will find here today that Daniel resolved in his life to carry himself in the right way. In this section right here, if we look in verse 1 again, Daniel introduces the theme of the entire book, because he says in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, the Lord, in verse 2, delivered Jehoiakim. It was God's doing. It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar, it was God's doing. And so he introduces the theme that God is in control of everything that is going on. It is the control of God that cost Judah its nationhood and cost Daniel to be carried off into captivity. God in his sovereign power directs the affairs of men. Faithless and unbelieving Jehoiakim, he's taken off the throne, he's taken away, and Judah is under some other ruler. He also took articles from the temple, expensive articles and sacred articles. And that would be a thorn in the side of the people of Judah for a long time. It would be upsetting to them. Now let's look and see what happens here with the exiles in Babylon. Verse 3 and following. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the court of officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Bring me some of the Israelites. Bring in some of the Israelites, but not just anybody. It has to be some people who are talented. Physical appearance was important. People without physical defect and handsome. Intelligence was important. With an aptitude for learning, quick to understand, it says, well-informed, qualified too. Qualified to be in the king's house. Members of the nobility. Members of the royal household. And notice the first thing that they do. This is a way to begin indoctrinating this group into Babylon, and maybe even what we might call brainwashing them. They changed their names. They took their Jewish names away. And they were assigned Babylonian names. New land, new identity, new life. Put them in training to acclimate them to this culture so they would learn about it. Treated them like they were royalty. They ate from the king's table. To change the name of these young Hebrew men was an attempt to refocus them toward a new life and a new lifestyle and a new culture. Even the vestiges of their Hebrew worship represented by their names were to be replaced by Babylonian names that were after Babylonian gods. The conflict is in clear perspective here. Look at these names that they changed here. First, Daniel. Daniel means Elohim is my judge. They changed his name to Belteshazzar, which means may Bel protect his life. Bel is a god from Babylon. Elohim is another name for Yahweh, another name for God. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious. Changed his name to Shadrach. And again, another Babylonian god, Aku, is exalted. Mishael, who is what Elohim is. Meshach means who is what Aku is. And then finally, Azariah, Yahweh is my helper. And his name was changed to Abednego, the servant of Nebo, another name for the god in Babylon. All once named for some form of God's name, and now they're transferred over to be Babylonian gods. However, you'll notice as we go through this, throughout the book, Daniel never did forget his Hebrew name. He never succumbed to allowing someone to use that name. In fact, when Daniel was in the lion's den and the king of Babylon came to check on him, he called into the door, "O Daniel, servant of the living God." Daniel made an impression on them. Imagine the influence that these pagan people, the Babylonians, had on these teenagers, because they were probably 14 or 15, 16 years old when they were there. It changed their view of the world and of mankind and the view of God and sin and redemption. Everything that they taught them was diametrically opposed to what they had learned growing up worshiping Yahweh. They were educated and as thoroughly Babylonianized, as one commentator said, as they possibly could do. McLaren describes the objective of the process as being meant to denationalize them and strip them of their religion, thus making them tools for easier governing of their countrymen. One of the most important strategies that Satan has is to distort our worldview and convince us that what we as Christians have learned is incorrect. And so what we get from him is that he's a liar. Jesus said he was the father of lies. Our world today is constantly working to convince us about Satan's lies. It's constantly trying to convince us that the Christian lifestyle is not the correct lifestyle, that some other alternative is better for us to go to. Christian, though the forces against you are great, take heart, stand firm, dare to be a Daniel. That's what I want you to see out of this lesson today. Don't let the world overtake you. Dare to be a Daniel. Now let's look at verses 8 through 10. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself either. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than any of the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." He was speaking literally. The king would have his head. But one of the most important lines in all of Scripture is here in verse 8, where it says, Daniel resolved not to defile himself. As a young man, he had resolved to live out his life as he had been taught as a follower of Yahweh. For a long time in another church, I taught high school seniors. And as I taught those high school seniors, one of the things I tried to get them to do during that year, I was saying to them, you're going to go off into a profession after this year. You're going to go off to college. You're going to need a set of standards to live by. And now's the time to set those standards. Set those standards in your life and resolve to keep them. Make up your mind before you're faced with a situation. And make up your mind about those big things so that when someone tempts you or something tempts you, you can say, no, I'm not going to participate. And that's what Daniel said. He was not going to participate. He was not going to defile himself. It reminds me of the language of Nehemiah 5:15, when Nehemiah, who was governor of Judah when they returned, and he saw preceding governors had overcharged the people for food and wine, he said, but out of respect for God, I did not act like them. He acted like God wanted him to act. The language that Daniel uses here when he says he's going to resolve not to defile himself, it really could be interpreted to mean he proceeded to put upon his heart. The heart was the center of consciousness as far as the Hebrew people was concerned. It was the place where you made your decisions. It was the place where you respected your God. And so Daniel put it on his heart to make this decision ahead of time. The word defile here brings us to think about the Levitical Code. In fact, Leviticus 11 was filled with prohibitions, and especially prohibitions about food. Daniel knew that eating the royal food would probably prove to be problematic because he knew that the people in Babylon ate pork and they ate horses. Both of them were forbidden in Leviticus. They ate unclean foods that had been submitted to the idols. And so he did not want to compromise himself and his religious convictions by partaking of that food. And so he's going to ask the steward to let him have a different diet. There are two problems here that he wants to avoid. He wants to avoid the things that are unclean because of the Mosaic law. And then secondly, he wants to avoid things that have been made unclean. Some are unclean by nature, and some have been made unclean because they've been placed on the idols for worship. Obviously, this wouldn't be an easy thing for Daniel to do. But Daniel had prepared himself to pursue holiness. He had prepared himself to live out his life to his convictions. He had made up his mind. He had covenanted with God. Even his name meant that he would always be accountable to God. Elohim is my judge. So he was accountable to God in everything that he did, and he did not want to come up short. Think about this as well. Daniel's dedication to this idea not only determined the whole course of his life, but his resolute commitment to God probably was an influence on his fellow captives' life as well. His companions followed in Daniel's footsteps. They acted like Daniel. And maybe they had made the commitment themselves. We don't know by the scripture, but we know Daniel could be a role model for them. This was the inevitable consequence of his original determination not to defile himself. This was the confidence of living faith that hopes in the presence and the help of God. Everything that resulted from that point forward were a result of the confidence that he had placed in God and a result of him making the decision to follow God. I like the way Alexander McLaren puts it. He says, the great lesson to be learned from this incident is that religion should regulate the smallest details of our life. And that is not narrow over scrupulousness, but fidelity to the highest duty. When a man sets his foot down about any small matter and says, no, I dare not do it, as little as it is, and as pleasant as it might be to sense, because I should thereby be mixed up in a practical denial of my God. So why didn't Daniel do it? Because it was not in God's will for him to do it. It was not something that God wanted him to do, and he did not want his witness to be spoiled. God had caused the official to show favor to Daniel, so that was on his side. It again highlights God's sovereign role in this situation. If they ate the best of the king's food and wine, while Daniel and his friends did not and ended up looking better, this person, he said, the king could have my head, and he was right. No one in the kingdom dared disobey in a direct order by King Nebuchadnezzar. These were absolute monarchs, and they had the power of life and death over their subjects. And by stating that God caused Ashpenaz to have a favorable attitude toward Daniel, the writer again emphasized the fact that God was in control and he was able to direct the hearts of the captors as well as the heart of the captives. It was God's sovereign will. Now look at verses 11 through 13. It says that Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." He took his request to the guard rather than Ashpenaz. And it appears that the guard was favorable to them, and God had made him favorable to them. And he says, I don't want anything but vegetables and water to drink. You give everybody else here the things from the king's table. Now, by vegetables, a little different than what we think. It probably meant anything from which a seed will grow it. And so that could have been fruits. It could have been nuts. It could have been all kinds of grain. And so it didn't rule out everything except tomatoes and so forth. It was a good, healthy diet. The king's choice certainly would have included meat and rich desserts, and was a rich diet. And what Daniel was proposing is drinking water and eating this diet, this healthy diet, and making he and his friends in line with the Jewish dietary laws. They knew that if they ate this diet, that they would not be out of line with the Levitical Code. If the guard agreed to feed them this menu, Daniel and his friends could maintain the integrity to this aspect of the law. These Babylonian officials were taking a great risk, as I said. One statement that I read in McLaren said that his fear gives a striking sidelight as to the conditions of service in such a court, where no man's head was firm between his shoulders. That could happen any time. And it could happen in a split second. If you displeased the emperor, Nebuchadnezzar, he could have a guard come over and just cut your head off. That was within his power. So this good-natured servant lets these young men have their way, much to wondering in his soul, no doubt, as to why they don't want this rich food. But he will find out. Look in verses 14, 15, and 16. So he agreed to do this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Now, this is just Harry's speculation, but I would imagine that the people who were on the king's table, with all of the things that they could eat, they were given, free license to eat and drink. They did it to excess. Now, they didn't look very good, I would think. Sometimes they could have even been drunk, but they also could have overeaten. Daniel and his friends ate a healthier lot, and they didn't eat to excess. They looked healthier and better nourished. They were judged on their appearance. In fact, the word that's used here actually means fatter in flesh. It's the same words that are used in Genesis 41, 2 and 18, describing Pharaoh's dream about the fat cows coming up out of the Nile River. The success of this experiment of these young men illustrates what McLaren calls a picturesque example of a large truth. God suffers no man to be a loser by faithfulness, and more than that, makes up all that is surrendered for His sake. No man left anything for Christ's sake, but receives 100-fold to this life. And so these young men were rewarded. In fact, if you look in verse 17, it says that to these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. God gave them knowledge and understanding. Daniel did not want the credit for their appearance to go to the king and his training process. He wanted it to go to God. And so that's why he writes here and said, God gave them these things. Understanding visions and dreams, though, was Daniel's special talent. You notice it says, and to Daniel, he could understand all kinds of dreams and visions. That would be important. It would be important later when he would be challenged to understand dreams that the king had. It would be important because it prepared him and prepares the reader that dreams are going to be important in the rest of this book, and we'll see that in later lessons. Now look at at verses 18 through 21. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. He found them above everyone, head and shoulders. These 4 young men completed this 3-year course, and at the end of that college, if you will, they were at the top of the class. They were at the head of the class, and it was obvious to King Nebuchadnezzar. He could see it. And from all indications, Nebuchadnezzar was pleased with that. At the same time, though, remember, the 4 of these young men, Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah, Mishael, they had not compromised themselves. They had kept their commitment and their relationship with God. And God blessed them. God is the person who gave them knowledge. Notice in verse 17, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds. It was a reciprocal relationship as far as Daniel was concerned. They kept God's laws. They kept their faith in God, and God blessed them at the end of the time. You know, while it's important to us to have understanding, it's also important to us to understand that God is the person who leads us through understanding and who leads us through knowledge. I'm reminded of Paul's writing. Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:8, and he says this, while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. Verse 21 reminds us that Daniel's personal holiness had an influence on 3 different kings in the land where he was in exile. He was in exile as a captor, but his holiness stood out. And because of that, he influenced Nebuchadnezzar II, 606 to 560 BC. In the first 3 chapters of Daniel are filled with that. He influenced Nebuchadnezzar III, 555 to 539 BC. This is the king also called Nabonidus, whose pride was broken and surrendered himself to the Lord. We'll get to that story It's a very, very interesting story, and Daniel plays the central role in that whole story. And then he influenced Belshazzar, who is the king who's conquered by Cyrus the Great out of Persia. He's the one who saw the handwriting on the wall at the banquet that said, Babylon's about to fall. So what is God's message to us here? Well, in my reading, I ran across what I thought was a good example of what God's message is for us out of this story about Daniel. And it comes from a book that I've been reading that I think is very good for us in Daniel. And this is what the author says there. He says, of interest to us all is the message that this story sends to us about the believer's participation in society, particularly in the political arena. Daniel exemplifies active service in governmental affairs under divine leadership. On the other hand, the story teaches that there should be limits to one's commitment to the state. When the believer is asked to commit acts that violate God's laws, refusing is not only acceptable, but a biblical directive. Now, I'm not teaching civil disobedience in this Sunday school lesson this morning, but I will say that God has intended us to live by His laws. And as long as we can do that in conjunction with the society in which we live, that's what we need to do. But God does not expect us to change our mind about His laws and live according to man's laws. We should live according to the authority of the king, as Paul says. But we should also live according to God's authority. And when we come to the point where we can't do both of those things, there's a problem that we have to deal with. And it's a difficult problem for us because society is always trying to push us into the worldly way, into the materialistic way, into the way that the world thinks and not the way that God thinks. But we always have to dare to be like Daniel. You know, there's a hymn that's entitled, Dare to be a Daniel. I didn't realize that. I thought there might be, but it's an old hymn written by Philip Bliss, one of our great American hymn writers. It's not one that I learned as I was growing up, so I'm not going to attempt to sing it for you this morning, even one verse of it. But I want you to listen to the words of it. The words speak to our Sunday school lesson. Listen carefully. Stanza 1. Standing by a purpose true, heeding God's command, honor them, the faithful few, all hail to Daniel's band. Many mighty men are lost, daring not to stand, who for God had been a host by joining Daniel's band. Many giants, great and tall, stalking through the land, headlong to the earth would fall, if met by Daniel's band. Hold the gospel banner high, on to victory grand, Satan and his host defy, and shout for Daniel's band. And this is the refrain that comes after each one of those verses. Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm. Dare to make it known. Christians, you can't be wishy-washy. If you committed your life to God and He's committed to you, He expects you to stand up for Him. He expects you to stand firm. He expects you to stand true. He expects you not to fall, but to stand tall, to be like Daniel, and to stand on your convictions. My hope and my prayer for you today is that you would dare to be like Daniel. As you leave your house tomorrow morning, if you're going to work, if you're going to school, wherever you might be going, live tomorrow like Daniel, with convictions in your life that govern what you do and say, and don't deviate from that. That's my prayer for you today. I hope you have a good week.